Welcome to Mr. Midnight Screams, where the darkness holds more than just shadows, and every grave has a story that refuses to stay buried. I'm your host, bringing you real accounts from real people who've stepped too close to the thin line between our world and whatever waits on the other side. Before we begin tonight's tale, if you're new here, hit that subscribe button. We're racing toward 1,000 subscribers, and every single one of you helps keep these stories alive. Share this video with someone who appreciates a good scare, and let me know in the comments. Have you ever worked a job that followed you home in ways you never expected? Tonight, we're walking the gravel paths of Willowbrook Cemetery, where a groundskeeper's routine became a 3-month nightmare that changed everything he thought he knew about the dead staying dead. Turn off the lights. Let the darkness settle around you like an old blanket. And let me tell you about the job that taught me some work never really ends. I'm posting this story anonymously because I still live in the same county where this happened, and small towns have long memories about certain kinds of stories. If you know central Pennsylvania, you might know Willowbrook Cemetery. It sits on 47 acres of rolling hills, about 15 minutes outside Millfield, established back in 1889, when the original church graveyard ran out of space. I worked there as head groundskeeper for 6 years. It was good work, steady pay, benefits, the kind of job where you can listen to podcasts all day and nobody bothers you as long as the grass stays trimmed and the walkways stay clear of leaves. I'm not superstitious, never have been. When people asked if working in a cemetery spooked me, I'd laugh and tell them the living gave me more trouble than the dead ever had. I wish I could still say that. The cemetery is divided into sections by decade. The oldest part, Section A, dates back to the 1890s. Weathered headstones lean at odd angles, and the names are carved so deep you can run your finger through the letters like they're wounds in the stone. Section B covers 1900 to 1920, mostly families who died in the influenza pandemic. The newer sections stretch out toward the back, flat bronze markers that the riding mower can pass right over. My daily routine was simple. Arrive at 7 a.m., check the main office for any burial or maintenance requests, then start with Section A and work my way back. Mondays were for mowing, Tuesdays for trimming around the headstones, Wednesdays for leaf cleanup, Thursdays for general maintenance, fixing anything that needed fixing, Fridays for preparation, making sure weekend burials would go smoothly. I'd been following this routine for years when things started changing in ways so small I almost missed them. It began in September, right when the leaves started turning. I was doing my usual Wednesday cleanup in Section A when I noticed something odd. There was a grave about halfway down the 3rd row where the leaves seemed to collect differently, not scattered like everywhere else, but arranged, neat little piles on either side of the headstone, like someone had raked them there on purpose. The name on the stone was Eleanor Marsh, 1934 to 1987. I'd seen it hundreds of times, but I'd never really looked at it, you know? It was just another marker to trim around. I scattered the leaf piles with my rake, thinking maybe the wind had played some trick. But the next Wednesday, they were back. Same position, same neat arrangement. I started paying attention. Eleanor's grave sat under an old oak tree, one of the original trees from when the cemetery was established. big enough that its canopy covered maybe 6 other graves in the surrounding area. But those graves never had the leaf arrangements, just Eleanor's. I looked up her records in the office. Eleanor Marsh died at age 53. Heart attack. No surviving family listed on the burial paperwork. The kind of lonely death that makes you pause and think about your own life. Her plot had been purchased by the county, which usually means someone died without money or people to claim them. But here's what got to me. The plot had been paid for in advance, years in advance. Eleanor had bought and paid for her own burial when she was 35 years old. What kind of person plans their own death at 35? October brought more changes. I'd arrive each morning to find small objects on Eleanor's grave. A smooth river stone one day, a single acorn the next. Once, a button from what looked like an old coat, brass with an anchor design. Always placed carefully at the base of her headstone, never scattered or dropped. I started checking the cemetery's security footage. We had cameras at the main entrance and the maintenance building, but nothing that covered the individual sections. Too expensive. And honestly, vandalism wasn't usually a problem. Most people respected the dead enough to leave them alone. The footage showed the usual activity. Visitors during the day, mostly older people bringing flowers to family plots. A few joggers who used the cemetery roads for exercise. Nothing unusual, and definitely nothing that explained who was leaving gifts for Eleanor Marsh. That's when I decided to stay late one evening, not all night, just until after sunset, to see if I could catch whoever was doing this. I parked my truck behind the maintenance building and walked to Section A with a thermos of coffee and a folding chair. The cemetery feels different after dark. Sounds carry farther. The wind through the trees sounds like whispers if you're not careful about what you let your mind do. I positioned myself about 50 yards from Eleanor's grave, behind a large monument that gave me a clear view while keeping me hidden. The sun went down around 6:30 and I settled in to wait. For the first hour, nothing happened, just the normal sounds of evening settling in. Cars on the distant road, a dog barking somewhere in town, the rustle of small animals moving through the grass. Then, around 8 p.m., the temperature dropped. Not gradually, like you'd expect with sunset. All at once, like someone had opened a freezer door. My breath started showing in little puffs, even though it was still October and not nearly cold enough for that. And that's when I saw her. A woman in a dark coat, walking between the headstones with the careful step of someone who knows exactly where they're going. She moved like she'd walked that path 1,000 times before, never hesitating, never looking around to get her bearings. She stopped at Eleanor's grave and knelt down. From my hiding spot, I could see her place something at the base of the headstone. Then she sat back on her heels and stayed there, perfectly still, for maybe 10 minutes. I couldn't see her face clearly in the dark, but I could see her profile. Gray hair pulled back in a bun, sharp cheekbones. The kind of elegant posture women had in old photographs when they were taught to sit up straight and keep their hands folded. She stood up, brushed off her knees, and walked away the same direction she'd come. I waited until I couldn't see her anymore, then crept over to Eleanor's grave to see what she'd left. It was a small silver locket, tarnished with age, the kind that opens to hold 2 tiny photographs. I almost opened it. My thumb was on the clasp when something stopped me. Call it instinct, Call it respect for privacy. Call it fear. I left the locket where she'd placed it and went home. The next morning, I arrived early and went straight to Eleanor's grave. The locket was gone. In its place was a small white flower, the kind that grows wild in fields. It looked fresh, like it had been picked that morning. I checked the security footage from the night before. The camera showed me arriving and leaving, but no sign of the woman in the dark coat. Nothing to explain how she'd gotten in or out of the cemetery. That afternoon, I did something I probably shouldn't have done. I called the county clerk's office and asked them to pull Eleanor Marsh's death certificate. I told them I was updating cemetery records, which wasn't entirely untrue. The clerk was helpful. Eleanor had died on October 15th, 1987 at Millfield General Hospital. Cause of death, cardiac arrest. Next of kin, none listed. But there was something else. A note in the file that the deceased had been found by a neighbor, Dorothy Henley, after Eleanor failed to show up for their weekly lunch date. Dorothy Henley. I asked the clerk if Dorothy was still alive. She put me on hold for a few minutes, then came back with an address. Dorothy was 89 years old and lived in assisted living about 20 minutes from the cemetery. I drove over that weekend. The Golden Years Assisted Living Facility was one of those places that tries too hard to look cheerful. Bright yellow walls, artificial flowers in every corner. The kind of place where they play music from the 1950s in the common areas because that's when the residents were young. Dorothy Henley was sharp as a tack despite her age. She had clear blue eyes behind thick glasses and the kind of firm handshake that lets you know she wasn't always 89 years old. "You're asking about Eleanor," she said, when I introduced myself and mentioned the cemetery. It wasn't a question. I wondered when someone would finally ask about Eleanor. We sat in the facility's garden, a small courtyard with benches and raised flower beds. Dorothy poured tea from a thermos she'd brought, and I told her about the gifts appearing on Eleanor's grave. "That would be Eleanor herself," Dorothy said, as matter of fact as discussing the weather. She always was particular about keeping things tidy. I must have looked skeptical because Dorothy smiled and patted my hand. "You think I'm a dotty old woman," she said. "I don't blame you. But Eleanor and I were best friends for 43 years, and death doesn't change friendship. It just changes the visiting hours." Dorothy told me Eleanor's story. She'd never married, worked as a seamstress in town for most of her adult life, lived alone in a small house on Maple Street, kept to herself except for her weekly lunches with Dorothy. Eleanor had what you might call episodes, Dorothy explained. Panic attacks, the doctors called them, but they were more than that. She'd get these feelings that something terrible was going to happen, and she couldn't shake them. Started when she was young, got worse as she got older. The week before she died, she told me she'd been having dreams about her own funeral. Said she could see herself in the casket, could see people standing around her grave. But in the dream, nobody came to visit her afterward. Nobody remembered her. Dorothy sipped her tea and looked out at the flower beds. Eleanor was terrified of being forgotten, she said. That's why she bought her plot so early, made all the arrangements herself. She wanted to make sure everything was done properly, even if there was nobody left to do it for her. "And after she died?" I asked. Dorothy smiled. "After she died, I visited her grave every week. Same day, same time as our old lunch dates. I'd bring flowers, sometimes a book to read aloud. the way I used to read to her when she was having one of her bad spells. I did that for 35 years, until my arthritis got so bad I couldn't manage the walk anymore. Haven't been able to visit for about 6 months now. The pieces clicked into place. The gifts had started appearing around the same time Dorothy stopped visiting. Eleanor was taking care of her own grave because the one person who remembered her couldn't come anymore. "She's waiting for me," Dorothy said quietly. "Eleanor never did well alone. Even in death, she needs to know someone remembers her, someone cares that she existed." I offered to drive Dorothy to the cemetery the next day. She accepted, and we arranged to meet after breakfast. That night, I lay awake thinking about Eleanor Marsh, alone in her grave for 35 years, so afraid of being forgotten that she couldn't rest even in death. Some fears, I realized, are strong enough to survive anything, even dying. The next morning, I picked up Dorothy at 9 a.m. She dressed carefully for the occasion, wearing a navy blue dress and a small hat with a feather in it. She carried a bouquet of yellow chrysanthemums and a thermos of tea. "Eleanor always loved chrysanthemums," she explained as we drove to the cemetery. "Said they were the only flowers that got prettier as they aged." We parked near the main office, and I helped Dorothy walk to Section A. Her arthritis made movement painful, but she was determined. When we reached Eleanor's grave, Dorothy gasped. The headstone was clean. Not just clean, but polished. The brass nameplate gleamed like it had been buffed that morning. The grass around the grave was trimmed perfectly, edges sharp as a razor. Even the oak tree above seemed to have arranged its branches more gracefully. "Hello, Eleanor," Dorothy said, settling carefully onto the small folding stool I'd brought for her. "I'm sorry it took me so long to visit. My old bones aren't what they used to be." The air around the grave grew warmer. Not dramatically, just a few degrees, like stepping from shadow into sunlight. Dorothy didn't seem surprised. "I've brought tea," Dorothy said, opening her thermos. "The good kind, with honey, the way you liked it." She poured 2 cups, placing one on Eleanor's headstone and keeping one for herself. For the next hour, Dorothy talked to Eleanor the way she might have talked to any old friend, about the weather, about changes in town, about people they'd both known who had died in the years since Eleanor's passing. I stood a respectful distance away, close enough to help if Dorothy needed anything, far enough to give them privacy. And I swear on everything I hold sacred, I could hear 2 voices talking, Dorothy's clear and strong despite her age, and another voice, softer, like an echo of conversation carried on the wind. When Dorothy finished her tea, she placed the empty cup next to Eleanor's headstone. The cup that had been sitting on the stone was empty too, though I never saw anyone drink from it. "I'll come back next week," Dorothy promised as I helped her stand. "Same time, same day, just like old times." As we walked back to the car, Dorothy turned for one last look at Eleanor's grave. A woman in a dark coat stood there, barely visible in the morning light, but solid enough to cast a shadow. She raised her hand in a small wave, and Dorothy waved back. "Goodbye, Eleanor," Dorothy called. "See you next week." I kept my promise to drive Dorothy to the cemetery every week. We established a routine. I'd pick her up Sunday mornings at 9. We'd visit Eleanor until 10:30. Then I'd drive Dorothy back to Golden Years in time for lunch. The gifts stopped appearing on Eleanor's grave. The elaborate leaf arrangements disappeared. The headstone returned to normal weathering, the way a 35-year-old grave should look. But sometimes, usually when Dorothy was telling Eleanor about her week or sharing news from town, I'd see movement out of the corner of my eye, a shadow that shouldn't be there, a sense of someone listening just beyond the edge of sight. This went on for 3 months. Dorothy grew frailer, but she never missed a Sunday visit. Even when she needed a wheelchair, even when the nurses at Golden Years suggested the trips might be too tiring, she insisted on coming. "Eleanor needs to know I remember," she'd say. "Some promises you keep forever." Dorothy passed away on a Tuesday in January, peaceful, in her sleep, the way everyone hopes to go. The funeral director asked if I knew of any specific burial requests. Dorothy had left instructions to be cremated, with her ashes scattered in the Golden Years garden where we'd had our first conversation. I was the only person at Dorothy's small memorial service. No family left, no close friends except the ones who preceded her in death. Just me, the facility chaplain, and a handful of staff members who'd cared for her. That Sunday, I went to Eleanor's grave alone. The temperature dropped the moment I arrived, that same sudden chill I'd experienced months before. Eleanor stood beside her headstone, more solid than I'd ever seen her, wearing the same dark coat, but looking somehow younger, less burdened. She looked at me and smiled, not sad, not grateful, just peaceful. Then she turned and walked away, her footsteps making no sound on the gravel path. I understood. Dorothy had kept her promise, had remembered Eleanor faithfully until her own death. Now they were together again, somewhere beyond the reach of fear and loneliness. I never saw Eleanor again after that day. Her grave returned to normal, collecting leaves and weathering like every other grave in Section A. The brass nameplate tarnished, the grass grew at the same rate as everywhere else, and the elaborate arrangements disappeared. But sometimes, when I'm doing maintenance near that oak tree, I catch a whiff of chrysanthemums on the breeze. And occasionally, very occasionally, I find 2 teacups sitting side by side on Eleanor's headstone, both empty, as if 2 old friends had shared one last cup of tea before saying goodbye to the world that had forgotten them.